Good morning, America. How are ya? Monday Morning Rail. Hi, I'm Denny Jelsma, and I'm at the world-famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida, where the sun always shines and running trains is a pleasure. Today is Monday, and you know what we do on Monday? You guessed it. We do show and tell. Show and tell is going to start in just a moment, but show and tell is always brought to you by Jelsma Graphics, the people that make all the railroad embroidery clothing, hats, shirts, jackets, club shirts. We make it all since 1985, 40 years of making embroidery clothing. So go to jelsma.com. With all that being said, show and tell is going to start right now. Show and tell starts right now. We got a very exciting show, and we're going to talk about a train called the Seminole. It was a train that ran from Chicago, Illinois to Jacksonville, Florida, and that's where actually the Seminole terminated. And it was a secondary train, and I want to talk a little real quickly about secondary trains. Every major railroad that was in the passenger business had their number one train, and then they had a secondary train going usually to the same place. For an example, if you wanted to go to Seattle and you were on the Milwaukee, you would take the Milwaukee Olympia Hiawatha, and their secondary train was called the Columbia, and it ran usually about 12 hours apart. Same thing with the Great Northern. They had the Great Northern Empire Builder, then they had the Western Star. The Northern Pacific had the North Coast Limited, and then they had their secondary train. And so on and so on. And the East Coast, for an example, the Seaboard had the Silver Meteor, and their secondary train was called the Silver Star. Now, a lot of people may argue about, was it a secondary train? Well, it really was, because it started out as a second section of the Silver Meteor, and then they just renamed it. But all the equipment went on the Silver Star, the real high-class equipment. And so the same thing, the Illinois Central. Although the Illinois Central Seminole started out being a number one train, and it was a train that left Chicago and had heavy Pullmans. It was all heavyweight. And then in the 1940s, they introduced the City of Miami, an all-coach train, and it was really kind of a luxurious coach train, the City of Miami. Later on, they added sleeping cars to it, and the Seminole just kept plugging along and ended up being the secondary train. For an example, the City of Miami left at around 8:40 in the morning, and 24 hours later got into Jacksonville at about 8:35, 24 hours later. The Seminole left at about 10:30 at night, and 34 hours later got into Jacksonville. It was a slower train, but it was all heavy Pullman. And I've got a example here of my Seminole. So let's just start out, and I'll tell you what our Seminole is. What I've got here for my Seminole is the Central of Georgia. The Seminole ran over it from Birmingham all the way to Albany, Georgia, and they had two engines dedicated, 810 and 811, and this is in the Illinois Central. This is in the Central of Georgia colors. This is both engines are Central of Georgia. This one here is a Broadway. I had Mike Stamey of Southeast Models. He custom painted this in the old Georgia Central style. But this train was a heavyweight. It averaged about 30 miles an hour, and compared to 50 some miles an hour of the City of Miami. And when the City of Miami started adding sleepers, that's when the City of Miami became the #1 train to Florida. but the Seminole was kind of the workhorse. It usually had 4, 5, 6, up to 10 head-in cars many times. But and it had coaches, and it had heavy sleeping cars because it was 2 nights out. When it left Chicago at 10 o'clock, that was night. The next night through Georgia, Alabama and Georgia, and then it got into Jacksonville in the morning. But this here is my example of the Seminole. Seminole lasted all the way up to the late 60s, but in the 60s it was about 2 to 3 cars. And here, number 2, if you can get a quick picture of the drum head where it shows the Seminole drum head on it. Yeah, Illinois Central also used the train as a pricing when they priced for sleeping cars and compared to, let's say, the city of Miami. And so you could get some winter package bargains, but you always had to travel on the Seminole, which naturally took 34 hours compared to 24 hours on the city of Miami. Now, if you could just kind of spam this train number 2, and it is just a gorgeous train, even with heavyweights. And the Illinois Central was just noted for making their passenger trains clean, crisp. But it ended in Jacksonville. But if you wanted to go to Miami, they usually had 1 to 2 cars that was designated to go to Miami. They would switch them in Jacksonville, put them on the Florida East Coast. If you wanted to go to, say, Tampa, they would have a Tampa car. They would have a Sarasota car, and they would have a St. Petersburg car. And so the network of how you could get around with the passenger trains was just absolutely really down to the science.
And you might also mention that they had a St. Louis Jacksonville sleeper quite often also.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. They advertised heavily in the St. Louis market to come to Florida, and they left the beautiful train shed there in St. Louis, and they connected at Carbondale, Illinois. And same thing, if you wanted to ride on the city of Miami, they had cars that they would leave St. Louis, go to Carbondale, and then they would add them to the train going south. You know, I just take a look at it. I found by traveling by train then and now, back in 1948, to take this train from Jacksonville to Chicago, Chicago to Jacksonville and back, but one way was $32. In today's fare, if you would, say with inflation, that $32 is $361. If you take a sleeping car, it costs you about $20 more. And so it would cost $600 or say $700 in today's. But if you take Amtrak and go from Chicago to Jacksonville, you're going to be 2 nights out, and you're going to be paying $500 to $600 a night for a sleeper. And if that's not ridiculous, then they wonder why nobody wants to ride Amtrak. Here I'm a great train enthusiast, and I don't want to ride Amtrak because it is so bad. And so the same airfare, for an example, back then was $71. In other words, it was twice as much to take an airplane, a DC-4, from Chicago to Jacksonville, and you had to make about 3 stops. But still, and it took about 12 hours, and versus 24 hours on the train, just to kind of give you an example. And so today's $71 fare would be $800. Today you could get a flight from Jacksonville for $150 to $200. It's very common. And so the Amtrak has just not really kept up with wanting to all passengers, in my humble opinion. And so the Seminole was a very important train, carried a lot of head-in baggage, REA, and also had an RPO on it. Very, very interesting train, and this is my model, and that's the way it was in Jacksonville, Florida, at the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum, where running trains is an absolute pleasure, peace and harmony.